In my last video, What Europeans Don't Understand About Trump, I made a side comment about one potential advantage that European conservatism has vis-à-vis its American counterpart. I subsequently received several comments and queries about this issue, so I thought I'd expand on that right now, but with a bit of a twist. So, for starters, this is what I said on the subject in that other video. European conservatism does have one advantage vis-à-vis American conservatism, namely that the latter has liberalism baked into it in a way that the European variety does not. America was founded on rebellion against the king and on the Declaration of Independence, which itself has liberalism in its opening wording. That is, a European conservative sentiment like "for king and country" has no strength in the United States. And so European conservatism is technically capable of being more conservative than American conservatism, and one sometimes sees this in small conservative pockets in Europe. European conservatism can thus potentially be very deep, but it is very narrow in its reach on the continent, while American conservatism must necessarily be shallower, but is on the other hand far broader in its reach. So the point is that because American conservatism was founded on a spirit of freedom and rebellion, it is by nature more liberal than certain older and more deep-seated European versions of conservatism. And by liberal, of course, I mean here classical liberal and not liberal in the modern American sense, that is to say left-wing. But what is the philosophical background of this issue? Delving into that will help us understand the difference between the American and European versions. There were many conservative thinkers in England who preceded the rise of what is today called the liberal tradition in the English-speaking world, and they arguably go back to John Fortescue in the 15th century. The point here is that these conservative thinkers, by and large, had less of an influence on the American founding fathers than did what came afterwards. This means that the philosophical starting point for British conservatism lies further back in time, whereas the starting point for American conservatism is more recent, falling really in the second half of the 17th century. The earliest thinker in that starting point is really John Locke, who was followed by, for example, Montesquieu and Adam Smith in the 18th century. Even if one were to say that through the influence of John Locke, Thomas Hobbes is also an important foundational figure in America, Hobbes is more liberal than he's sometimes given credit for, if credit is the right word here. While he was, of course, a monarchist, he still recognizes, for instance, a citizen's natural and inalienable right to self-defense. Further, a social contract theory, which Hobbes represents, introduces a degree of liberalism into the system by dint of the concept of consent. And in fact, Hobbes was criticized by more conservative and religious figures already in his own day, such as by the Anglican clergyman Ralph Cudworth and the Archbishop of Armagh, John Bramall. This latter person, John Bramall, even called Hobbes's Leviathan a rebel's catechism. Now, I don't really mean this as a critique of Hobbes, who actually happens to be one of my favorite political philosophers, but the point is that the tradition that inspired the founding fathers was more liberal than the tradition that inspired many conservative thinkers in England and parts of the European continent. Another important figure to consider here is Edmund Burke, and where he stands in this whole issue. Well, Burke is considered a conservative hero today, especially for the American conservative tradition, but this fact actually leads to the same conclusion as previously. And that's because Burke was actually not so conservative by the standards of his own day. He was a member of the Whigs, after all, even if a moderate one. And the fact that he is considered a conservative icon today is a sign of how liberal many strands of conservatism have become over time. In my book, Western Self-Contempt, Oikophobia and the Decline of Civilizations, I wrote, "It is significant that Burke was praised by liberals in the 19th century, but, as time wore on, came to be praised more and more by conservatives, a fact that indicates how the political spectrum as a whole is moving, with a few backs and forths, toward the left." So much for the philosophical historical explanation. A final point to consider is the following brief statement of mine from that other video that I mentioned in the beginning. Let's take a listen again. That is, a European conservative sentiment like "for king and country" has no strength in the United States. In response to this, some people commented that while we may not have for king and country in the United States, we certainly have for God and country. But that's not exactly right. It's true, of course, that the United States today is more religious than Europe, and I, for one, am very happy that we are still a religious nation to a considerable degree. But the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise of Religion Clause in our First Amendment stem from a liberal tradition, and they lie at the heart of the American founding. They appear conservative to us today mainly because the left has become so radical in its anti-religious and anti-Christian assault on our traditions. But God as a civic institution in the United States has never had the same force as the monarchy in many European countries. I want to close by saying that I'm not at all relativizing the differences between American conservatism and American liberalism. The differences between these two today are much greater than the differences between right and left in most of Europe, as in fact I've written about elsewhere. And American conservatism today is by and large more conservative than European conservatism, because genuine conservatism in Europe has basically died, though hopefully we're about to see a resurgence of it. It can also be said, and this is the twist that I mentioned in the beginning, that the rebelliousness and ruggedness of the American yeoman is its own kind of conservatism, since rebelliousness can entail the preservation, the conserving, of local lifestyles in the face of a sometimes overbearing progressive government. So just as American conservatism has a degree of liberalism baked into it, so too this kind of rebelliousness or liberalism can at least potentially have a type of conservatism baked into it. In fact, I have another video that to some extent treats the subject of localized conservatism, and it's called Oikophilia, the love of home. Oikophilia entails the love of a home, its accompanying friendships and rituals, the importance of religion, and it is the care of home through private associations and local charity rather than through top-down governmental control. But in any case, it's still useful in order to understand ourselves as Americans, what our conservatism means and where it comes from. And for those of you who are deeply interested in the topic, I do in fact have an academic book chapter coming out on conservatism and pseudo-conservatism in the United States. Hopefully it'll be out soon, but academic publishing is notoriously slow. But I'll certainly announce it here on YouTube and on my social media when it's available. Until then, I'd love it if you'd consider supporting my work by hitting the subscribe button and bell icon below so that you'll see the next uploads. Because by supporting me in that way, you help me produce more videos, of course, and you also help me produce my philosophical writing and be a dissenting voice, speaking of rebelliousness, in intellectual and academic circles. Thank you.